Humans were banned for 800 years. Then the galaxy broke the treaty. There are things that the galaxy forgot on purpose. Not forgot the way you forget something small and unimportant. A name, a date, an unremarkable event in the long chain of unremarkable events that make up most of history. Forgot the way you forget something that made you uncomfortable, something that didn't fit the story you wanted to tell about yourself, something that was easier to erase from the maps and the records and the official histories than to explain. The galaxy forgot humanity on purpose, 800 years ago. The most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, the Galactic Council, with its 12,000 years of precedent and procedure and the accumulated weight of civilizations too numerous to count, had looked at one species, barely two, centuries into interstellar travel, and made a unanimous decision: remove them, not defeat them, not conquer them, not absorb them into the Council's structure as a minor member with limited rights and managed influence, the way the Council handled species it found inconvenient. Remove them entirely, erase the routes, edit the maps, close the borders, seal the world and the people on it behind automated systems, and let the galaxy move on as if the whole experiment of humanity reaching the stars had simply never happened. The public explanation was brief and polished. It appeared in the official record in the careful language of institutional decision-making, the kind of language designed to communicate a conclusion without revealing the reasoning behind it. Humanity, due to incompatibility with galactic standards of conduct and the unpredictable nature of their societal responses to interstellar engagement, is hereby excluded from galactic space pending indefinite review. Incompatibility, unpredictability, the language of something being classified as a problem rather than a threat, clinical, distant. The real explanation lived in sealed archives and the specific conversations that elder species had in the specific contexts where the official language didn't need to be maintained. The real explanation was simpler and considerably more honest. Humans did not fight to win. They fought to end things, and the galaxy, which had spent 12,000 years building a political and military structure that depended on conflicts having manageable outcomes that could be negotiated into the existing framework of power and influence and carefully maintained balance, had no idea what to do with that. To understand the treaty, you have to understand what humanity had been like before it, not in the abstract, not the broad strokes summary that the official histories provided when they mentioned humanity, at all, which was rarely, in the specific. In the quality of their presence in the galaxy during those first 2 centuries, before the Council made its decision. They had been young. Not young in the way of naive or inexperienced, young in the way of something that had not yet developed the specific cynicism that long exposure to galactic politics tended to produce. Curious, enthusiastic in the way of beings who found everything genuinely interesting and had not yet learned to perform interest as a social function, while actually feeling something, more guarded underneath it. They cooperated in ways that other species found difficult to model. Not because cooperation was unusual in the galaxy. The Council itself was built on the principle of cooperation between species. But human cooperation had a quality that the Council's political analysts, trying to assess it using the frameworks they had developed over millennia of watching species interact, consistently underestimated. It wasn't strategic. Most interspecies cooperation in the galaxy was strategic. You cooperated with beings whose cooperation benefited you. You maintained alliances that served your interests and adjusted those alliances when the interests changed. This was normal. This was how the galaxy worked. This was, in fact, the foundation of the entire Council framework, the careful management of interests to produce outcomes that enough parties found acceptable to sustain. Human cooperation didn't work that way. They formed attachments, not alliances, attachments. The specific quality of connection that humans developed with beings they had worked alongside or been in danger with, or simply spent enough time with to have developed the kind of understanding that humans seemed to develop whether or not it was strategically advisable. They bonded with species they had no strategic reason to bond with. They defended beings they had no treaty obligation to defend. They stood between allies and danger in situations where retreat was the rational choice. Not because their doctrine required it, not because the calculation of interests supported it, but because the attachment was there, and the attachment made retreat feel like a specific kind of wrong that their psychology categorized differently from the ordinary wrong of a bad strategic decision. The galaxy had encountered stubborn species before. It had encountered fierce species, loyal species, species whose cultural codes produced behaviors that were difficult to predict and difficult to manage. But humanity's combination of adaptability and principle, the specific quality of beings who could learn any system and use it effectively, and still refuse to use it in ways that violated something they had decided was non-negotiable, had produced, in those first 2 centuries, a series of incidents that the Council found increasingly difficult to process. The incident at Varath Station, where a human civilian contractor had organized an improvised defense of a refugee column, using equipment that was technically owned by the Dominion, and that the Dominion had specifically said was not to be used for that purpose. The equipment worked. The refugees survived. The Dominion's complaint to the Council was technically valid and politically impossible to act on. The engagement at the third boundary, where a human military unit, outnumbered and under orders to hold for exactly 40 minutes before withdrawing, had held for 4 hours because the species they were holding for had not been able to complete their evacuation in 40 minutes, and the human commander had made a decision that her orders did not cover. The Kethes Agreement renegotiation, where a human trade representative had pointed out, with careful documentation, that the agreement as written systematically transferred resources from smaller member civilizations to larger ones in ways that the smaller members had not understood when they signed, and had then refused to sign the renewal until it was changed, and had waited, with the specific patience of someone who had decided that the waiting was the point, until it was. Each incident individually had a resolution. Collectively, they represented a pattern that the Council's senior members found more alarming than any individual event could justify. Humanity treated principles as non-negotiable. In a system built on the premise that everything was negotiable, that was the one thing the system could not accommodate. The accord passed unanimously. 1 clause. 1 sentence. Humanity is forbidden from galactic space. Any violation will be met with absolute response. The implementation took 6 months. Automated border systems, positioned at the edge of human-explored space, configured to detect and report any crossing. Trade routes rerouted. Diplomatic channels closed. The navigational databases of every Council member updated to remove the routes that led to human space, not marked as restricted, simply removed so that a navigator using standard charts would find not a closed door, but an absence, a gap, a region that the chart suggested had nothing worth going to. Earth's transmissions were still technically receivable for species with the right equipment, but nobody was required to respond, and gradually the response rate dropped, and the transmissions from Earth adjusted to the new reality. Broadcasts aimed outward into a galaxy that had decided not to listen. And then, in the specific way that exclusion works when applied to an entire species, the silence settled in. The galaxy moved on. The Council conducted its sessions. The empires managed their territories. The trade routes ran and the diplomatic functions happened, and the ordinary business of galactic civilization proceeded without the particular complication that humanity had introduced. And Earth, alone, sealed, excised from the maps, was assumed to have faded. The galaxy was wrong. The thing the Council had misunderstood, in the decision to exclude humanity, was the difference between removing a species from the galaxy and removing the galaxy from a species. Awareness. Earth knew it had been excluded. The decision had been communicated, not through a formal diplomatic channel, because the formal diplomatic channels had been closed as part of the exclusion, but through the specific way that information moves when you are paying attention and you understand what the cessation of normal contact means. Humanity had understood. Had spent several years in the specific way of beings who respond to unwelcome information by processing it thoroughly, Understanding the decision, the reasoning behind it, the specific qualities that the Council had found incompatible, the particular pattern of behavior that had produced a unanimous vote for exclusion rather than the managed incorporation that was the Council's standard approach to species, it found difficult, and then had gone to work. Not on changing the Council's mind. Not on the diplomatic rehabilitation that might eventually lead to readmission. Not on any of the approaches that a species might take if its primary goal was reintegration. On the problem. The specific problem of a galaxy that had decided to exclude them and that contained, within its boundaries, the various beings and situations that humanity's particular psychology found it difficult to ignore, because the galaxy was not, after 800 years of Council management, a just place. It had never been a just place, and 800 years without the particular complication of humanity had not made it more just. The same dynamics that had produced the incidents the High Council found incompatible were still present. The same patterns of powerful species extracting from less powerful ones. The same management of interests that consistently managed some interests more thoroughly than others. The same system that worked well for the beings who had designed it, and less well for the beings who hadn't had a voice in the design. The situations that would have produced the incidents the Council had found incompatible were still occurring. They were simply occurring without humanity being present to respond to them, and so Earth had prepared, not for war, not for conquest, not for any of the aggressive outcomes that the Council had feared when it made its decision. For the moment when the galaxy's own behavior violated the treaty that had been the foundation of humanity's exclusion. Because humanity, with its particular relationship with principles and its particular tendency to take agreement seriously, had been very clear about one thing since the day the accord was signed. We will honor this. We will stay. We will not cross the line, but the line runs both ways. The system was called Lethus 9. It was not strategic. It had no particular resource value, no military significance, no position in the complex geography of galactic power that would have made it worth fighting over in any conventional analysis. It was agricultural. A mixed civilian population, species from half a dozen different civilizations who had come here at various points for various reasons and had stayed because the world was livable and the community had developed the specific quality of coherence that comes from people who have been neighbors long enough to know each other. 14 million people living their lives. The Dominion fleet arrived without announcement on a Tuesday, or what passed for Tuesday in the local calendar, which ran on a 26-hour cycle and had developed its own names for the days that were unrelated to any galactic standard. 3 cruisers, a carrier, 4 escort vessels, the specific configuration of a force that had been sent to make a point rather than fight a war, large enough to be unambiguous, not so large as to suggest the Dominion expected meaningful resistance. The stations were seized in the first 2 hours. Efficiently, without significant incident. The station security forces were present and had equipment, and the equipment was not matched for what the Dominion brought. The cities came next. The broadcast went system-wide, by right of expansion. This system now belongs to the Dominion. Residents are advised to register with the new administrative authority within 72 hours. The Council convened. The Council debated. The Council delayed in the specific way of an institution that has spent 12,000 years developing. The ability to process difficult situations through procedure, with the result that the procedure itself had become a form of inaction disguised as action. And on the 3rd day, a Dominion cruiser, pursuing a civilian transport that had attempted to leave the system without registering with the new administrative authority, crossed a border that had not been tested in 800 years. Human space. The borders, automated systems did what they had been doing for 800 years. They verified, they recorded, they compared the event against the parameters they had been given, and then they sent one message, straight to Earth. The war archive was deep. Not metaphorically, physically, structurally deep, built into the geology of the Pacific. Plate at a depth that put it below the reach of every conventional weapon and most unconventional ones. Built when the accord was signed, by people who had understood that honoring the treaty and being prepared were not contradictions. The archive had been dormant for 800 years, not abandoned, not forgotten, maintained with the patient thoroughness of an institution that had decided to take a very long view by the people whose job it was to maintain it. Checked, updated, kept ready by a succession of individuals who had dedicated their careers to the preparation for a moment that most of them privately expected would never come. Admiral Mara Kincaid had been chief of the archive for 11 years. She was 62 years old, the product of a military family that had been involved in archive work for 4 generations. Her grandmother had been part of the team that had upgraded the monitoring systems in the 23rd year of the archive's operation. Her mother had served as a junior analyst before rising to a diplomatic role. Her father had spent 30 years in the technical division before retiring. She had grown up understanding, in the specific way of children who grow up inside institutions, what the archive was for. She had spent 11 years making sure it was ready. The treaty violation indicator had been dormant her entire tenure. When it activated, she was in the middle of reviewing a routine maintenance report on the border monitoring systems. A quarterly review, the kind of document that confirmed that everything was functioning as designed and nothing had changed. The light had been dark for 11 years. It was red now. She set down the maintenance report. Around her, the officers on duty were doing the specific things that people do when something they have been trained for but never experienced suddenly becomes real. Moving quickly, speaking in low voices, the particular quality of a room full of professionals processing the transition. From theoretical to actual. Is it real? Someone said. Run the verification, someone else said. Run it twice, a third voice said. Mara looked at the indicator, at the archived documentation of what it meant. At the event, logs that the monitoring system was already compiling. At the identification of the vessel, the trajectory, the border, crossing, the Dominion registry, the confirmation that this was not a malfunction or an accident. At 800 years of preparation. Wake everyone, she said. Her voice was even. She looked at the primary command interface. Activate protocol homecoming. On the surface, nothing was visible. This was by design. 800 years of preparation had included considerable attention to what preparation should look like from outside, and the conclusion had been nothing. The specific nothing of an exclusion zone that had been exactly as quiet as an exclusion zone was supposed to be, for exactly as long as it had been supposed to be quiet below the surface. And in the specific orbital and deep space positions that human engineering had been placing things in for 800 years, systems came alive. The shipyards that appeared in public documentation as museums, preservation sites for early interstellar vessel designs, maintained as historical artifacts and accessible to scholars who applied for the appropriate permits, were not exclusively museums. The museum portions were accurate. The rest was less easy to categorize. The asteroid bodies that had been labeled as nature preserves, regions of the solar system set aside for scientific observation, accessible to researchers, periodically surveyed to confirm their preservation status, were not exclusively nature preserves either. The science was real. The observation was genuine. The asteroids were also in very specific positions for reasons that had nothing to do with their scientific value. The observatories were observatories. They were also targeting arrays. The distinction between these two functions was, in the specific technical domain where they overlapped, not as large as the casual observer might assume. Humanity had not stagnated. The galaxy had given humanity 800 years to think about what it wanted to be ready for. And humanity had used the time. The Council felt it before they were told. The subspace monitoring systems that the Council's intelligence apparatus maintained throughout the galaxy had, over 800 years, developed a very detailed understanding of the background signature of human space. The specific pattern of a sealed, inactive region that produced the readings consistent with its apparent status. Those readings changed, subtly at first. The kind of change that the automated systems flagged for human review rather than treating as immediately significant. The kind of change that an analyst, reviewing the overnight reports over their morning coffee, would note and pass upward through the chain. Then, less subtly, ancient warning buoys, systems that the Council's technical historians had identified in the deep archive records as pre-Accord infrastructure and had classified as dormant, non-operational, historical artifacts, began transmitting in archaic galactic standard, in a register that the translation systems recognized as formal and official and addressed to all receivers simultaneously. The message was short. You broke. The treaty. We are no longer bound. The emergency session convened before the message had finished propagating through every diplomatic channel. The chamber was full in a way that emergency sessions were full when the emergency was not a crisis. In the ordinary sense, but something larger. Not a problem to be managed, but a reality to be reckoned with. Every major delegation, every species with council membership, the full presence of the most powerful governing body in the galaxy, assembled in the middle of what had been, until an hour ago, a quiet diplomatic period with no major conflicts. Pending. Who sent that message? Earth is sealed. That's impossible. The border systems have been active for 8 centuries. Nothing has crossed. Check the logs. Check every log. An elder delegate, from one of the species that had been present at the original Accord, whose civilization's records included the actual deliberations rather than the public summary, spoke into the confusion, quietly, with the specific quality of someone saying something they had been holding for a long time. It was never sealed, she said. The chamber went still. The Accord sealed the routes, she said. It closed the borders. It removed the maps. She looked around the chamber. It did not seal Earth. It contained the contact. A pause. Those are not the same thing. The first human vessel appeared near Lethis 9. 36 hours after the treaty, violation indicator had activated on Earth. 11 hours after the Council's emergency session had begun. 6 hours after the Dominion's Council representative had been in the middle of presenting the Dominion's position on the Lethis 9 situation, that the system was legitimately claimed under provisions that the representative was prepared to discuss at length, and had been interrupted by the alert. The ship did not arrive through hyperspace in the conventional sense. There was no transit signature. No, the characteristic distortion that faster-than-light travel produced, and that every council member's detection systems were calibrated to identify. It was simply there, where it had not been, and then where it was, the transition between the 2 states producing nothing that the detection systems had a category for. A vessel that the Dominion fleet's tactical systems, attempting to assess and categorize, returned readings on that were, the tactical officer's words in the report filed afterward, inconsistent with any known hull classification and inconsistent with any unknown hull classification that our assessment parameters can generate. Old. The hull was old in the visible sense of something that had been through a great deal and had been maintained through all of it. Not the elegant old of ceremonial preservation, but the functional old of something that had been worked and repaired and worked again, the accumulated history of continued use written into the material. The markings were clear, a circle of blue. A single white star. Earth. The Dominion fleet armed weapons. The targeting systems acquired the human vessel, the size of it, the configuration, the specific position it had taken between the Dominion fleet and the civilian population centers of Lethis 9. The human vessel did not arm weapons, it transmitted. The transmission was open, broadcast on every available frequency, received simultaneously by the Dominion fleet and the Council's emergency session and the civilian population of Lethis 9 and every monitoring system within range. This is Admiral Mara Kincaid of the United Terran Accord. The voice was even. The tone of someone who is calm, not because the situation doesn't require something more intense, but because the situation requires calm specifically. You are operating in violation of galactic agreement in a civilian system. You have caused harm to civilian infrastructure and civilian populations. A pause. You have 10 seconds to begin withdrawal. The Dominion commander's response came through the same open channel. It was not withdrawal. Humans were excluded from galactic space 3 centuries ago. You have no authority here. You have no standing. Your presence in this system is itself a violation of the Accord and will be. The Accord required humanity to remain outside galactic space, Mara said. It required the signatories to maintain the conditions that made that exclusion the terms of the agreement. A pause. You crossed our border. You violated the terms. The Accord's obligations on our side ended when yours did. A longer pause. Your 10 seconds are gone. The human ship did not fire. This was the detail that every tactical analysis of what followed spent the most time on. The specific absence of any offensive action from the human vessel, combined with the specific nature of what happened to the Dominion fleet. Space changed, not dramatically, not in the way of weapons effects or energy discharges or any of the conventional expressions of force that the Dominion fleet's tactical systems were designed to detect and respond to, in the way of physics behaving differently than physics had been behaving a moment before. Gravity shifted, not everywhere, in specific precise locations, the specific locations where each Dominion vessel was positioned. The gravity wells that appeared around each ship did not appear with the violent intensity of a weapon, but with the patient, comprehensive certainty of a natural phenomenon. The same certainty that the planet below them exerted on everything in its vicinity, just suddenly and precisely applied to a set of coordinates that happened to correspond exactly to the Dominion fleet's formation. Navigation collapsed. Not attacked. Not jammed. The navigational systems were still functioning, still receiving data, still processing. The data they were receiving and processing was simply no longer consistent with the data they needed to navigate. Space around them was doing things that the navigation system's models of how space behaved did not account for. And the systems, built to navigate rather than to operate in environments where navigation was impossible, had no protocol for what they were encountering. Engineering systems reported failures that the engineers could not explain. Not damage, not anything that corresponded to a weapon effect, just systems ceasing to function in the specific way, of systems that have been asked to do something in an environment that the systems weren't built for. It lasted 47 seconds. When it was over, the Dominion fleet was in a configuration that could be described as dispersed, disoriented, non-functional for offensive purposes, and entirely intact, not destroyed, not damaged, removed from the tactical situation in the same way that you remove a chess piece from the board, not by breaking it, by placing it somewhere that is not the game. The council chamber received the visual feeds from Lethis 9's monitoring systems, watched the Dominion fleet's dispersal, watched the human ship remain where it was, between the fleet and the civilian population centers, in the specific position of something that has decided where it stands and is not moving. The chamber was quiet for a long time. Then someone said, "We need to communicate with them." And someone else said, "What do we say?" And the elder delegate who had told them about the difference between sealed and contained looked at the feeds and said quietly, "The truth would be a reasonable starting point." Mara's hologram appeared in the council chamber, not because she had been invited, because she had been monitoring the council's communications and had sent the connection request in the council. After a brief discussion about whether accepting it was the appropriate procedural step, had accepted it because the alternative was conducting a session about her without her present. She appeared at full scale, the holographic projection, system rendering her as she was, in the uniform of the United Terran Accord, in the war archive that had been running at full capacity for 36 hours. "You cannot return," a delegate said. The words were not aggressive. They were the words of someone reaching for the framework that had governed the last 800 years and finding it less solid than it had been. The Accord required us to remain absent from galactic space, Mara said. It required us to close our borders and remove our presence and not engage with the galaxy's affairs. She looked around the chamber. We did all of those things for 800 years. The Accord was clear. The Accord was a bilateral agreement, Mara said. It required things of us, and it required things of the Council. When the Council failed to maintain the conditions the Accord was built on, the Accord changed. A single border crossing. The border crossing was the trigger, Mara said. not the cause. The cause is documented in 800 years of records. She looked at the chamber. We have been watching, not because we wanted to interfere, because we could not stop watching. It is not something we are capable of. Not watching when we know what is happening. She paused. Lethis 9 is 14 million people, agricultural, no strategic value. The Dominion took it because it could, and the Council was debating procedure while 14 million people lived under occupation. The chamber was quiet. Is that a mischaracterization? Mara said. It was not. Nobody said so. Why this system? The speaker said. Why now? If you have been watching, why this and not the other things that have happened in 800 years of the Council's management of the galaxy? Mara looked at the speaker for a moment. This system had an old frequency, she said. Explain. When? Humanity was excluded. There were humans already in galactic space, working, living, in places throughout the galaxy. They were given the opportunity to return to Earth or remain where they were. Most returned. Some didn't. A pause. The ones who stayed, and their descendants, maintained a communication frequency. Human designed, passed down through generations. Not broadcasting to Earth directly, because the border systems would have flagged it, but maintaining it, keeping it alive. She looked at the speaker. Someone on Lethis 9 used it. The chamber absorbed this. They broadcast on a frequency that has been maintained for 800 years by descendants of humans who stayed in the galaxy when their species was excluded, Mara said. Because they had been taught that if things became bad enough, the frequency was there. That someone was listening. She paused. We were listening. And that was enough? The speaker said. One transmission on an old frequency and you. Humans answer calls, Mara said. The words arrived in the chamber with the weight of something simple and true. That is what we are. That is what 800 years of the galaxy deciding we. We're too unpredictable to manage didn't change. When someone calls, when someone uses the specific channel that says I need help and I don't know if anyone can hear me, we answer. A pause. We have always answered. The Council threatened consequences. The Council discussed unified response. The mustering of member civilizations' military resources against the return of a species that the Accord had been specifically designed to keep out. The reactivation of the protocols that had established the border systems in the first place. Mara listened to the discussion. When it had run its course, when the chamber had worked through the options and the counter-options and the assessment of what each response would produce, she said, "That's a reasonable position. I understand why you're considering it." She activated a display. Earth's defensive perimeter appeared in the chamber, not a map. A real-time feed, pulled from the monitoring systems that humanity had spent 800 years developing and positioning and maintaining. The chamber was quiet. Thousands of vessels. Not all of them in configurations that corresponded to any known ship classification. 800 years of development without the constraint of galactic standards had produced things that the Council's technical analysts reviewing the AI feed found difficult to categorize. Millions of autonomous systems distributed throughout human space and beyond it in ways that the display was only partially revealing. Sensor networks. Defense infrastructure. The accumulated investment of 8 centuries of a species that had decided the most important thing it could do with the time it had been given was be ready. This is what we built, Mara said, while the galaxy had peace. She let the display run. We are not here to rule, she said. We are not here to restructure the Council, or reorganize the political geography of the galaxy, or take anything that belongs to anyone else. She looked at the chamber. We are here because 14 million people asked, on a frequency that has been maintained for 800 years by people who never stopped hoping someone was listening. And we are here, she said, because you failed them. Not this one time. Over and over, in the ways that powerful systems fail the people they were built to serve when they have been powerful long enough to forget that serving is the point. She looked at the speaker. We hoped you would do better, she said. We waited 800 years hoping you would do better. She was quiet for a moment. You didn't. The treaty was rewritten, not through a session, not through the formal procedure of drafting and amendment and committee review and floor debate and ratification that the Council's process required for formal agreements. Through fact, humanity was back, not in the orbital politics of the Council, not as a member state with a vote and a delegation and a seat at the table. Somewhere outside that structure, adjacent to it, present in the galaxy in a way that the Council's categories didn't fully capture. Not rulers, not subjects, not even, quite, members. Something else. Something the galaxy found difficult to name and found itself discussing in careful language that tried to capture the specific quality of a presence that was not threatening and not benign, and not anything that the existing vocabulary was quite adequate for. The Dominion withdrew from Lethis 9. Not immediately. There was a period of negotiation, and the negotiation had a specific quality of one side having more information about the other's capabilities than the other had anticipated, which tended to shorten negotiations considerably. But the withdrawal happened. 14 million people on an agricultural world with no strategic value, who had lived under occupation for 11 days, went back to their lives. On Earth, in the eye, war archive deep beneath the Pacific Plate, the treaty violation indicator dimmed, not off, dimmed. The specific level of a system that had been fully active and was returning to standby rather than shut down, the distinction between standby and shut down being the distinction between ready and done. And humanity was not done. The archive sealed itself. The dormant systems returned to dormancy. The ships that had moved returned to their positions. Not withdrawn, repositioned. The difference between removing a presence and making a presence less visible was a distinction that humanity, after 800 years of being very visible in a very specific way and learning what that visibility had produced, had developed a refined understanding of. Mara Kincaid filed her after-action report. It was thorough. It covered the treaty violation, the response, the council session, the Lethis 9 withdrawal, and the status of ongoing monitoring. In the section reserved for assessment and recommendations, she wrote, "The Accord was designed to address the Council's concern that humanity's presence in the galaxy produced outcomes that the Council's management framework could not accommodate. The concern was accurate. We did produce those outcomes. We continue to produce them. The question the Council was asking when it passed the Accord was, how do we manage a species whose behavior we cannot model using the frameworks we have? The answer they arrived at was, remove the species. The answer that 800 years of the galaxy's behavior suggests is more durable is, build better frameworks. We are not returning to be managed. We are not returning to be accommodated. We are not returning to make the Council's job easier. We are returning because someone called and we answered. That is what we do. That is what we have always done. That is, as best we can determine, what we will always do. The galaxy should plan accordingly." The story spread. Through the back channels and the informal networks and the specific conversations that happened between beings who had watched the Council's emergency sessions and the feeds from Lethis 9 and the display of Earth's defensive perimeter, and were trying to put all of it together into a coherent understanding. The version that spread most widely was not the tactical analysis or the political assessment or the diplomatic implications for the Council's structure. It was something smaller. Someone on Lethis 9 had used an old frequency, a frequency maintained for 800 years by the descendants of humans who had stayed in the galaxy when their species was excluded, passed down through generations by people who had kept it alive because they had been taught that someone was listening, and someone had been. And when the call came, the answer came, 36 hours later, across 800 years of silence, because that was what humans did, they answered. In the deep archive where the Council kept the records it did not make public, the entry for humanity was updated. The original entry, filed when the Accord was passed, carefully worded in the language of institutional decision-making, had described humanity as incompatible with galactic standards of conduct due to unpredictable societal responses to interstellar engagement. The update was filed by the elder delegate who had told the chamber about the difference between sealed and contained. She wrote, "Addendum, year 800 of the Accord." The original assessment was accurate in its observation and incorrect in its framing. Humanity was not incompatible with galactic standards of conduct. Humanity was incompatible with the specific conduct that galactic standards had normalized. There is a difference. The Accord was an attempt to manage that incompatibility by removing one of its elements. What the last 800 years have demonstrated is that the element we removed was not the problem and was the correction. Humanity did not return because they forgave us. They returned because someone called. They are here now. They will leave when they decide to. And if we break this treaty, we will not ban them again. We will spend the rest of our history hoping they decide to come back.